Russia is trying to deal with a much bigger problem than the Ukraine war. The internal conflict between the Russian mercenary group and the Russian army engulfed Russian cities such as Voronezh, especially Moscow. For this reason, Russia seems to have suspended its invasion plans in Ukraine for a certain period of time. When we look at the battlefield, we can see the signs of this. Ukraine used this advantage and made strategic gains on both the southern and eastern fronts. But Russian leader Vladimir Putin is preparing to take drastic measures to prevent this situation, describing the group's actions as treason. In an urgent television speech, Putin said that anyone who takes up arms against the Russian army will be punished. After Russian mercenaries launched an armed rebellion overnight, Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan spoke by phone with his counterpart, Vladimir Putin, urging him to act with common sense. This move of Erdogan had a great impact on the world agenda. International sources described this call by Turkish President Erdogan to Putin as a warning. In fact, that was exactly the case. Erdogan thinks Putin will act with anger over the turmoil in Russia. For this reason, he's making efforts to prevent the Russian leader from taking drastic steps in Ukraine or in any other region where he may target Ukraine. Erdogan was among the first leaders to have a phone conversation with Putin after his speech on the subject the other day. During the meeting, it was emphasized that no one should take action in the face of the complicated situation in Russia. Erdogan's warning stroking Putin seems to have worked. Likewise, this situation could cause Russian aggression to rise to the next level. A wrong move by Putin due to internal rebellion could disrupt the grain deal in the Black Sea and undermine Turkish and NATO efforts for Ukraine's victory. With the increase of Russian aggression in Eastern Europe, the Baltics and Scandinavian countries could put their contingency plans into action. A single move by Erdogan may have prevented them all. However, NATO's eastern wing was alarmed by the internal rebellion in Russia while putting the Polish army in a state of high readiness. Germany decided to send 4,000 permanent troops to the Russian border. Jens Stoltenberg also stated that they closely follow the developments in Russia. In a separate statement, the Kremlin said that Erdogan supported the Russian government's handling of the rebellion during the meeting with Putin. Meanwhile, the Turkish presidency announced that the duo discussed the latest developments in Russia, and Erdogan is ready to do his part to help Putin bring Turkey a peaceful solution. Erdogan has sought to maintain strong ties with both Moscow and Kiev since the start of the conflict in Ukraine. NATO member Turkey has refused to join its Western allies in imposing economic sanctions on Russia. Such an attempt would have hampered Ukraine's victory. Turkey had to be a mediator in the middle, but it also supplied Ukraine with weapons and called for respect for Ukrainian sovereignty. In line with these efforts, Speaker of the Grand National Assembly of Turkey, Mustafa Şentop, announced that President Recep Tayyip Erdogan was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts to resolve the Ukraine crisis. Also, in his first international phone calls after taking office, Erdogan sought to expand his country's role as a mediator between Moscow and Kiev. Turkish President Erdogan called Putin and Zelensky and offered mediation in the Ukraine dam crisis. According to Turkey's official statements, Erdogan first called Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky and then Russian President Vladimir Putin. Erdogan discussed the proposal to establish a mechanism that includes Russian and Ukrainian experts, the United Nations, and Turkey. Erdogan pointed to the joint mechanism known as the Black Sea Grain Deal Initiative for the proposal. Vladimir Zelensky, in turn, stated that he reiterated his country's urgent needs to prevent a disaster following the failure of the dam. Turkey's voice is important when it comes to withdrawing occupation troops from Ukrainian territory when it comes to the extradition of illegally detained Ukrainian citizens, especially the Crimean Tatars. Turkey is a prominent and mediator country. You may remember that Turkey and the United Nations mediated the Black Sea Agreement signed between Kiev and Moscow last year, allowing Ukrainian grain and other products to reach world markets. Ankara also hosted a series of meetings between Ukrainian and Russian human rights commissioners to organize a prisoner exchange meeting between the two countries. For this reason, the efforts of Erdogan, the leader of Turkey on the collapse of the Kakhovka Dam, are of vital importance in terms of reaching a solution to this issue. But still, Kiev and Moscow are held mutually responsible for the dam's collapse. On the other hand, Biden's administration said in a statement on this matter that it was working with its Ukrainian counterparts to understand the reason for the dam's collapse. Although the USA continues to work on this issue, the eyes and ears of Washington officials are also on a move from Turkey. In fact, another expectation of the USA from Turkey is to approve Sweden's participation in NATO membership. In fact, this is one of the main agenda items in Washington at the moment. Most NATO members quickly approve the applications, arguing that Finland and Sweden, with a shared 1,300-kilometer border with Russia, would strengthen the alliance in the Baltic. But Sweden's path to NATO membership passes through Turkey and Hungary before a summit in Vilnius in July, where it hopes to join its Scandinavian neighbor, Finland, as a full member of the alliance. Finland, which applied alongside Sweden, joined NATO in April. Turkey continues to block Sweden's membership due to security concerns. Anchor reported that Sweden should suppress anti-Turkey protests before giving the green light to join NATO. Also, Ankara says that Sweden has not taken security concerns seriously and has failed to fulfill a bargain made in Madrid last year that raised a number of issues that Stockholm had to address. But despite strong support from other members, including the United States and further talks with Turkey expected, no progress was made in this regard. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of last year convinced Sweden and Finland to abandon their long-standing policies of military non-alignment. Both countries see NATO as the best way to ensure their security with a collective defense clause. Turkey's leader, Erdogan, is expected to take warmer steps towards Sweden's accession to NATO, especially with the war getting more and more fierce. In recent months, demonstrators in Stockholm took actions that drew Turkey's negative attention. But Swedish Foreign Minister Tobias Billström said that freedom to demonstrate is enshrined in the constitution, adding that something legal is not always appropriate. In fact, both leaders have moderate statements on this issue. So what move does Hungary plan to make in this regard? Hungary says that Sweden has been hostile towards Budapest for years. Angered by Sweden's criticism of Prime Minister Viktor Orban for the perceived erosion of the rule of law, Orban denies such a case. Unlike Turkey, Hungary does not have a list of demands. But Hungarians emphasize that complaints must be addressed before Sweden can approve its accession to NATO. While Swedish officials say they are stunned by Hungary's stance, analysts think that the country will follow Turkey's footsteps in this regard. Swedish Foreign Minister Billström has been busy meeting with a number of NATO allies in recent weeks to ensure Stockholm's membership bid remains on the agenda, saying that there's no plan B beyond Sweden's accession to Vilnius. Sweden reported that it implemented the Madrid Agreement and that it was impossible to meet some of Ankara's other demands. But Ankara is demanding from Stockholm that protests against Turkey should be completely blocked. Still, Turkey has had frictions with its NATO allies before and has stepped back. Elsewhere, support for Sweden is strong, with leaders from Europe and the USA urging Ankara to move forward with ratification. Swedish and Turkish officials met on June 14 for talks described as good by Sweden's chief negotiator. And another high-level meeting will be held in Brussels before the Vilnius summit. In other words, this crisis will be resolved and the way for Sweden to become a NATO member will be paved. NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said it was unthinkable for the alliance not to support Sweden if it was threatened. Therefore, it will not be a surprise if Turkey approves Sweden as a result of the efforts of NATO, the USA, and other allied countries. Because the Ankara government is well aware of the importance of Russia posing a danger in the Baltics. Sweden is already in close cooperation with NATO, and integration measures are advancing. Sweden has a strong air force and a submarine fleet prepared for the conditions of the Baltic Sea. This is an important support for NATO in the region. In summary, it doesn't seem like it will take long for Turkey to understand the necessity of Sweden joining the alliance in this regard. The short-term rebellion of the Wagner Group troops could have a long-term impact on the Russian army. US officials noted that both military chiefs in Moscow and soldiers fighting in Ukraine may have been upset by the events caused by the Wagner uprising. The Russian army believes that as a result of the coup attempt, which almost sparked a civil war in its homelands, the enthusiasm of Russian soldiers in the ships may have diminished. On the Russian side, people are trying to figure out who is loyal, who is not, and what's going on while doing this. In addition to the chaos in the headquarters, the soldiers are just sitting and waiting in the barracks. No Russian soldier wants to be killed or hurt for lost war efforts anymore. Russian soldiers began to think that the end was approaching. These thoughts also sparked the death fears of the soldiers. Russia is withdrawing from many conflict zones due to the advance of the Ukrainian army. These withdrawals, the morale of the Russian soldiers, and the struggle patterns do not seem to be easy to correct. This would have disturbed some senior generals on the front line, which the Ukrainian intelligence agency claimed that several generals who were active in the war had taken advantage of the chaos found within the army and were preparing for another coup. It is known that there are generals within the army who do not support the war in Ukraine and who oppose the Putin administration. Although the names of these generals and their exact rankings are not known, it is believed that a second coup will increase the chaos in the Russian army. The loss of Wagner support by the Russian army has reduced the Russian military's offensive power by almost half, as it has badly affected the course of the war in Ukraine. The generals repeatedly to the Kremlin that they were upset by the situation. But like Prigozhin, the generals did not receive response from the Kremlin. US officials have also noted how losing the support of thousands of Wagner soldiers could have an impact on Russia. Yevgeny Prigozhin is believed to have sent about 25,000 troops to fight in Ukraine last year. Officials said the loss of these troops as a result of the coup attempt could possibly prevent Russia's attacks on Ukraine. Officials taking into account the official numbers given by Russia concerning its troops argued that 25,000 soldiers would mean 3 regiments. These numbers mean a large number of soldiers with a high level of training and experience, and a lot of heavy equipment that has not been available for at least a while are left out of the war. Officials said they believed that most of the Wagner Group mercenaries would want to be integrated into the Russian army, and that it was a huge loss for the Russian army to stay out of the war. So do the Wagner soldiers really want to join the Russian army? In a statement on the subject, Vladimir Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, said Wagner's mercenaries who wanted to sign a contract with the Russian Defense Ministry could still do so. Peskov added that the criminal case against Prigozhin and his troops would be closed after Wagner's boss ordered the troops to withdraw on their way to Moscow. The cessation of Wagner's uprising was the result of an agreement mediated by Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko, who saw the boss Prigozhin accepting his exile in Minsk. Prigozhin was seen yesterday after leaving the Russian city of Rostov with his troops. Putin hasn't been in front of the public since he stamped Wagner's rebellion as a knife. The Wagner rebellion was the worst incident that has happened to the Russian army during the war in Ukraine. In addition, the greatest turning point of the war in Ukraine, which has many milestones, has also begun to be seen as the beginning of this uprising. Although the uprising lasted for 1 day, even during this time, the situation caused the Russian soldiers who had lost their motivations to become even more reluctant to fight. In a video posted on social media in recent days, the Kaliningrad Reserve Forces say their commanders do not want to attack Ukrainian positions in the bloody conflict. In the video, one of the Russian soldiers said they were sent to death. The video, released despite the Kremlin's best censorship efforts, shows how the news of violent conflict that has devastated both Russian and Ukrainian forces in Putin's devastating war is circulating. In particular, the situation in Bakhmut, a city constantly bombed in the east of the country, which has become the focus of the war, is hidden from the Russian people. The cruelty of the war caused Russian soldiers to fear that they would not survive after being deployed to the front line. One of the biggest reasons for these fears lies in the fact that President Putin wants to send more and more military deaths to demand every kind of region he can. In the video, soldiers argue how angry they are at the death of their comrades and tell their officers that if they are forced to go to the front, they will clash in a stockroom and even flee or return home by taxi if sent there. One of the soldiers in the video: "Don't you want us to reject? Better to go to jail? Throw them all in jail and we'll stay there. No one will go there. How much penalty? 5 or 7 years or 10 years? We do not care. At least we will survive and do not waste the rest of our lives. For whom? For what are we fighting?" He said he was sent to death. The soldiers then told their commanders that they were willing to fight as a regional defense unit, that they held the occupied territories in their hands but refused to attack. They then talked to a soldier who claimed to have killed him. Another soldier, a man, came out, sat in a robe, directed his gun, and blasted his brain from his right forehead. Even the doctor was surprised, striking his head right in front of the repairman. "I was tired." He was screaming that I was already tired. Have you seen the lake of blood? If he did not go to attack, he would take the bullet instead. Is this normal? He says. So what exactly is happening in the Russian army? The very unprepared start of the Russian army to the war, the indiscipline and ruthlessness of the officials within the army, and the rebellious rebellion of many commanders against the Kremlin were the beginning of the collapse of Russia's army. Negative orders given during the clashes, lack of coordination, and the timely violation of the orders of the commanders of Russian troops caused a minor uprising within the army. Finally, Wagner's attempted coup d'etat also blinded the fire of rebellion within the army. Russia has taken 300,000 Russians into the army, along with its partial displacement announcement last autumn. Sending these soldiers to the front in a semi-trained and almost concealed manner, and subsequently opposing the command or fleeing their troops, is one of the main reasons for the onset of the uprisings. Ukrainian army has launched a project called I Want to Live after Russia's partial invasion decision. The aim of the project was to get Russian troops who did not want to fight to leave Ukraine and return to their families. The project I Want to Live at the end of the day has received more than 25,000 calls and is still looking for the line and asking for help, wanting to live with more traveling soldiers who want to get rid of the front. This even applies not only to soldiers but to some ranking officers as well. In this way, a Russian officer who surrendered to the Ukrainian forces revealed what was happening in the Russian army. A Russian commander who surrendered in recent days said Russian soldiers had shot and blown themselves up during the Ukrainian army's dominance over Russian troops' embankment last day. Thousands of Russian soldiers left behind large amounts of weapons, desperately fleeing the oppression. Instead of confronting the Ukrainians, some soldiers had to sacrifice their lives in the interrogation of the Russian lieutenant who surrendered. He explained that the units severely depleted during the war found themselves surrounded, that there were 12 soldiers, that 3 were taken prisoner, and that the others shot themselves. The chaos within the Russian army is, of course, an unavailable opportunity for the Ukrainian army. The fact that the recent offensive against Ukraine is taking place in such an environment is equivalent to the appearance of a bright white light at the end of the Ukrainian army's path to victory. The Ukrainian forces made a critical move against the Russian forces. The Russian army almost did not know what to do. This operation organized by the Ukrainian army took place thanks to a huge support from the Ukrainian allies in the operation organized by the Ukrainian army. The Russian Navy ships were almost looking for a hole to escape. This huge blow to the Russian forces proved that there was no way for Russian troops to cross the Dnieper. In response, Putin's fateful decisions have caused a global outcry. In the last days of the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war, Ukrainian forces started to make many new moves. The Ukrainian army, which started to take different steps in the war, proved its superiority on many fronts and battlefields. The Ukrainian army, which decided to take big steps against the Russian army on Ukrainian territory, organized meetings with the United States to squeeze the Russian soldiers on the sea and rivers. At this point, the fact that the support given to the Ukrainian army was quite critical changed the whole course. The Ukrainian army, which managed to make the best use of the aid that came after the conversation with the USA, managed to deal a big blow to the Russian soldiers. The steps taken by the Ukrainian army in the war in recent days have the quality to change the whole course. It was known that Russian forces were constantly preparing for an attack around the Dnieper. In addition, the Ukrainian forces, who were aware of everything that was being done, were expected to deal a major blow to the Russian army. After receiving all the necessary information, the Ukrainian army decided to act immediately to strike the expected blow. This step of the Ukrainian army will take steps at many points to Russian armies, Russian soldiers near the Dnieper. Ukrainian soldiers launched many Bayraktar drones in order to establish an intelligence network in this region where the operation was planned to be organized. This intelligence, provided by Bayraktar UAV to the Ukrainian army, took the first step of the Ukrainian army's blow to the Russians. After that, a big mistake made by the Russian army in the region changed everything. If we move on to the details of the operation, the Ukrainian army took action to get ahead of the Russian army in the last days of the war. With this decision taken by the Ukrainian army, it was known worldwide that Russian soldiers had taken a definite position. An operation plan was made to completely reduce the Russian structure in the Dnieper, which Ukrainian forces consider to be very critical. This operation of the Ukrainian army would play a major role in ensuring the dominance in the river. The Ukrainian army received information that 3 Russian Navy ships would sail near Dnipro for reconnaissance and observation. With the receipt of this information, a great preparation was started, and the first step of the blow to the Russian army was taken. The Ukrainian army gave the order to strike the Russian army, and at that moment, the course of the war changed completely. The Ukrainian army decided to use one of the best weapons at its disposal to further increase the force of the attack. HIMARS, known for its long range and power, began to prepare for this operation as Russian Navy ships began to land in the region for reconnaissance purposes. The Ukrainian army immediately equipped the entire coastline with HIMARS missiles. At the same time, the Russian ships, not even knowing anything about it, sailed from the harbor. The scout units of the Ukrainian forces saw the ships of the Russian army moving from the coastline where they were stationed. The Ukrainian army did not want to make a sudden decision for this operation and waited for the best time. As the Ukrainian army waited for the Russian ships to reach the desired point, the Russian ships began to enter the range sufficient for HIMARS missiles. This was the most suitable point for the Ukrainian army to take action. Ukrainian soldiers immediately took action to fire HIMARS missiles. The Russian Navy ships did not know what to do in this situation with all the preparations completed. Ukrainian forces fired HIMARS missiles, one after the other, literally showering Russian ships with missiles. Russian ships trying to escape from the missile fire began to scatter in all directions due to the impact of the incident. However, the destructive power of HIMARS missiles was not the only point Ukraine had planned. The Ukrainian forces, which kept the barrack drives which they had launched for reconnaissance ready for attack, struck a huge blow to the Russian army as a result of the attack of the Bayraktar UAVs. The Ukrainian forces immediately informed Bayraktar UAVs that the Russian ships were fleeing. Bayraktar UAVs, which reached the region in a short time, rained bombs on Russian ships. As a result, this operation, organized by the Ukrainian army, completely cornered Russia's. On one of the Russian ships, Reuters missiles hit the fuel tank with a huge explosion. The crew of the Russian ship burst into flames and started to leave the ship completely. However, the missiles were landing around the ship so fast that huge waves started to form in the river. These waves and missiles caused great damage to the Russian ships. One of the ships capsized due to the waves and was completely disabled. A missile hit the fuel tank of the ship, and the fire reached meters high and was completely destroyed in a short time with a huge explosion. 2 of the Russian ships sailing on the water for reconnaissance became completely unusable. Only one of the Russian ships survived, and this ship was unaware of anything that was happening as it escaped. Without looking back at the news that the commander received when the ship reached the port created a great shock. The commander who blamed Putin for the events had not supported the sailing of these ships across the river for reconnaissance from the very beginning. However, these ships, which set out on Putin's orders, were completely destroyed by Ukrainian forces. Putin is seen as the main reason for the mistakes made by the Russian army in many areas. Putin, who tries to have a hand in almost every operation, is causing a great defeat to the Russian army with his wrong decisions. While the Ukrainian forces are getting stronger on the war front with the aid they receive, the Russian army is losing more and more power every day. The flood of aid from many countries has transformed the Ukrainian army inventory into a limited number of powerful inventories. The Russian forces, which are trying to achieve success with old weapons and absurd strategies, will experience defeat, not victory. According to war analysts, the continuation of Russia's current course could soon lead to the end of the entire country. The people of Russia who argue that Putin must step down from power in order for Russia to return to its former state, continue their protests in the protests that continue in many parts of the country. Calls are made to end the war. Russian citizens organizing protests started to reveal all the facts from their social media accounts. The reflection on the cameras that the markets in the country are completely empty is proof of how much trouble the people are experiencing. As a result of this continuation of the problems in the country, it is a matter of time before Putin is removed from power. Putin was aware of this situation, as many broadcasting organizations in Russia make fake news and say that the Russian army is actually successful. Russian leader Vladimir Putin, who does not try to produce any solutions to the problems within the army, may soon be completely demilitarized. Interviews with Russian soldiers who escaped from the army and surrendered to Ukrainian forces had a great resonance around the world. Russian soldiers who said that it was better to be captured by Ukrainian forces than to fight for Putin's unjust occupation in the Russian army said that they were starved and sent to the front without any training.